Hey everyone, before I get started with the presentation, I just want to point out that this is going to be a pretty advanced topic, and it's a good reminder that when I do videos like this, there is a link to a transcript of the video that I host on my blog that might be very useful in this case to reference as you go through the presentation. So be sure to check it out if you find yourself getting lost. Thank you very much. This paper takes aim at free will theodicies in Christian apologetics by showing inconsistencies with other Christian doctrines commonly held by the free will theodicy defenders. And these other doctrines are meant to reconcile free will with God's omniscience and foreknowledge of our actions before we do them. In this project, I will grant, for the sake of argument, that libertarian free will both exists and is coherent, even though I do not think libertarian free will is actually coherent. I do this because I don't think arguing against libertarian free will is a useful counter-apologetic, and I believe that the free will theodicy fails even when granting libertarian free will is coherent and steel-manning the position. My goal is to show that Christian responses to the problem of evil while referencing libertarian free will are at best ineffectual at answering the problem of evil because libertarian free will does not preclude God creating what I will call a heaven world, where any natural number of created beings all freely choose to never sin and always freely choose to love God. Theistic and especially Christian apologists want to deny that God could create such a world, despite it being a logically possible world and God supposedly being able to do anything logically possible by way of his omnipotence. I have a particular interest in the doctrine of Molinism, which itself aims at reconciling God's omniscience with the libertarian free choices of creation. We will find that the doctrine of Molinism ends up causing significant problems for the free will defense and undermines the ability to deny that God could create the heaven world. Now, Molinism states that God has full knowledge of all counterfactuals, such as Bob will always freely choose X in situation Y. Now, in this schema, God looks at all logically possible worlds and then chooses which one he wants to instantiate along with the people who he wants to be in it. And then creation plays out deterministically, where the sum total of situations of the universe God created plays out, and each person God created goes through them. The key here is that each person supposedly makes a free decision that God knew they'd pick for every situation that they would end up living through. Now, Molinism is tied very closely to the free will defense, where theistic apologists want to say that God cannot create all logically possible worlds because if a person Bob will always freely choose X in situation Y, then God cannot create a world where Bob freely chooses not X in situation Y. They will then also insist that it is still logically possible that God could have chosen not X in situation Y, and so we are left with the conclusion that God cannot instantiate all logical possible worlds due to his creation having libertarian free will. This in turn then lets them claim that it is not possible to create a heaven world. Now, what strikes me is exactly how deterministic this libertarian free will ends up being. The idea is that Bob always freely chooses X in situation Y. Yet the theistic apologist will insist that somehow it is still logically possible that Bob chooses not X in situation Y. I believe this is where a hidden contradiction is being glossed over, because the word always ends up creating a rigid designator for the person Bob in this example. Note that in philosophical terms, a rigid designator designates the same objects in all possible worlds in which that object exists and never designates anything else. I'll put a link in the description for more on the definition. Now, in the free will defense, the word always means that Bob is rigidly designated as someone who will always freely choose X in situation Y. The problem then is that this means it is not logically possible for Bob to choose not X in situation Y. And so we end up with a situation where there is no logically possible worlds that God could not create, because the situation where it's supposedly logically possible for Bob to freely choose not X in situation Y isn't actually logically possible. Now, maybe that's too quick. Consider the alternative. What if we insist that always is not a rigid designator in terms of the identity of Bob, because we want to hold that it is logically possible that Bob freely chooses not X in situation Y. Well, in this case, there is a logically possible world in which Bob freely chooses not X in situation Y, and a logically possible world where Bob freely chooses X in situation Y. And so if both are logically possible, then it's actually up to God to choose which world to instantiate. But if this is the case, then the entire scheme for Molinism falls apart, because then God can't have foreknowledge of which choice Bob will make in situation Y without God having to choose which world to instantiate, which in turn seems to rob Bob of his supposedly free will. Now, what's worse for the theist is that this alternative sets it up so that God could choose to instantiate the logically possible heaven world. Now, perhaps the apologist will claim that the addition of the word always is a misrepresentation on my part, and that God merely has knowledge of counterfactuals so that Bob will freely choose X in situation Y, and will claim that there is no rigid designator. Now, the problem here is that we can pose exactly the same problem. I don't need the word always. We can always ask if there is a possible world where Bob will freely choose not X in situation Y. If the apologist says that there is no world, well then, the word will is what creates the rigid designator for the identity of the person Bob. Conversely, if the apologist answers yes, then the free will defense falls apart on the problem described above, because God then has to choose which world to instantiate, and so the heaven world becomes possible for God to actualize. Now, another possible response from apologists is to acknowledge that there is a rigid designator in the fact about Bob's free choice, so that the possible world where Bob freely chooses not X in situation Y is not actually Bob, but someone else entirely. Well, that's a valid track for them to take, but then the issue becomes, well, why would God create Bob? Because there seems to be infinitely many options that God has in terms of the people that he creates. So since we're using Bob here, let's call the base person Bob 0. And Bob 0 is the version of Bob that always freely chooses X in situation Y. But what about Bob 1, who is like Bob 0 in all respects? He has all the same physical attributes, prior decisions, but Bob 1 will freely choose not X in situation Y. Now, there seems to be no contradiction inherent in the concept of Bob 1, and so the existence of Bob 1 is logically possible. In fact, there seems to be a near infinite set of possible people God could create for any given person. Where any individual that exists, there's a version of themselves that would choose to love God given a series of situations Y that make up any given possible world that God creates. So even if we grant the existence of rigid designators, the free will defense doesn't rule out the possibility of a heaven world populated with the set of n number of people who would always freely choose to do the good in all circumstances that occur in that world. And in this case, n merely represents any natural number. So you can't get away with saying that only like 2 people would exist in this possible world. There's no contradiction in saying it's any natural number of these versions of all of the people that God created. Now, I hope it's clear that with whatever option the theist goes with in trying to keep free will in conjunction with God's omnipotence, his omniscience, it ends up undermining the free will defense. And I believe this is because theistic apologists are mixing a necessary sort of determinism to solve the theodicy with libertarian free will, which is then defined by its incompatibility with determinism. So, for example, we can see problems previously mentioned pop up once we get rid of the sort of determinism necessary for Molinism to work. So, what if we were to say about cases where Bob sometimes freely chooses X in situation Y, but in other times he chooses not X? Well, there seems to be no room for this libertarian freedom in the theodicies with Molinism, because then we get into problems with God's foreknowledge of free choices and God having to determine which logically possible world to instantiate. This makes the real choice happen in God's hands, not in the individual's. In fact, the only way these theodicies can work is if there is this strangely deterministic nature to a person's supposedly free choice. Notice the examples above are framed that Bob always freely chooses X in situation Y. In what way can the choice be said to be free for that person if situation Y is determinative of what the choice actually is? If the theist says that the person's nature determines the choice in situation Y, then it is not free because they couldn't have done otherwise. If the theist wants to deny that this common definition of libertarian free will, then God could create beings who by their nature would always freely choose to do the good and love God. Now, there's a bit of a nature problem lying under the surface here. And as I said, I'm not an advocate of libertarian free will. But my critique doesn't depend on falsifying the concept or proving it to be incoherent. All I need to do is show conceptual problems between libertarian free will, our notions of libertarian free will, and Christian theology and theodicies. Now, one major problem is our conflicting intuitions about the nature of free choices. Consider the following 3 thought experiments. Imagine a young teenage boy. After running around all day on vacation, he is taken to dinner with his family at a restaurant, where in typical fashion the child is ravenous due to being active and going through a growth spurt. When offered dessert, the only option is ice cream, but there are 2 flavors, vanilla and chocolate. The child has a strong preference for chocolate and so orders that flavor. Is the child's choice free? Now, this seems very much to be a case of free choice, but then the child is bound by his nature, which in turn determines his preferences. We don't get to pick our favorite flavors. They just are what they are. So it is not much of a surprise that in this situation the choice seems determined by factors outside of the child's control, yet we would still call this a free choice. Now, the second thought experiment is based around the fact that free choices don't actually have to be hard choices. And they can be determined out to all members of our species by the nature of our species. Now consider having to choose what to eat, but the only options presented are either a well-rotting carcass of a dead animal or a nutritious meal. In every case, for a human being capable of making an informed decision, they will choose the nutritious meal. This is because we, by our evolved human nature, are repulsed from well-rotted carcasses. Now, I hate to gross people out, but it is a blessedly rare for people these days to truly encounter exactly how terrible an experience it is to be near a rotting carcass. I didn't experience it until I was almost 40 years old, and so I kind of feel compelled to describe it. I had a small animal die beneath my deck in the winter, and then it basically started rotting and smelling in the early spring and summer. And so I was forced to crawl under the low deck and then get it out of there and then bury the remains. Now, suffice it to say, the smell, sight, feel of having to move it, even through gloves and multiple garbage bags, was utterly horrific. It was all I could do to not vomit into the layers of masks I put on to try and cover the smell. It is repulsive by its nature and our evolved senses. So when we get back to the thought experiment of the choice of what to eat, it does seem as though the choice would be a free one. After all, I could choose otherwise. I just wouldn't by my nature. So if free will is important, then God could create a world where everyone freely chooses to always do the good and to choose to love God, because it would be like deciding between a nutritious meal and a well-rotted carcass. And the final thought experiment is a little bit similar. Now let's imagine a scenario where after death we are brought before God and are informed which religion is the true one. It seems particularly odd to me that at this point it is quote-unquote too late for an individual to be given a choice to ask forgiveness for their sins and to choose to love God and follow His will. This is arguably a far more informed choice that one could freely make than the choice we face now in terms of which religion we find to be true and worth pursuing. After all, it's not as if people of other religions reject God or fail to love God. In fact, they believe they do and are aiming themselves at attempting to please God in as best the way they understand His desires for them to be. Even atheists, presumably, would want to know if they were wrong. I know I certainly do. And when given irrefutable proof of God's existence, why would it be, quote-unquote, too late to ask for forgiveness and freely choose to follow God? How then could this not be a free choice? If it were somehow not a free choice because we are effectively choosing between paradise and torture, then isn't us learning about the eternal consequences of not making the choice to love God also not free? There doesn't seem to be a way out here, nor a principled reason why post-mortem it's too late to choose to love God. Now, there was another issue I wanted to tackle, and it is God's supposed freedom. Now, I don't think that Christian apologists can deny that the choices laid out above are indeed free choices. Again, we will come to a two-pronged dilemma where neither option is good for the Christian theist. Consider God, where most Christians consider God's nature to be the ontological grounding of the good. Since it is given that no being can go against its own nature, it is literally logically impossible for God to do evil. As such, it seems to me, and Christian apologists like Richard Swinburne, that God is not morally free when it comes to his actions. One could point out that being morally free in this scheme is not actually good because it is not in God's nature to be morally free. But let's leave that aside for now. The dilemma I propose is this. If God is not morally free, yet can love and be worthy of moral praise, why then do we need moral freedom to choose to love God and be saved, or even have the capacity to sin at all? It cannot be that libertarian free will is valuable, because if God is the locus of value and by nature lacks libertarian free will with respect to morality, then it is by definition not valuable. Now, the alternative horn is that if God is free, but it is impossible for him to do evil, then it is logically possible to create beings who will never do evil or fail to love God, and yet they would still be free. And in this case, the free will defense would fail. This is a lot like the good nature argument that I was making earlier. Now, everyone's favorite internet Christian apologist, William Lane Craig, has something to say here. He wants to try and split this dilemma by insisting that even though it is impossible for God to choose to do evil, he is still endowed with libertarian free will. Let me bring up a quote from his website. I do affirm that God's being essentially good means that goodness is a property which God could not have lacked. Indeed, on my view, God just is the paradigm of goodness in every possible world. This entails that God cannot do evil, since that would be contrary to his very nature. First, you assume that freedom entails the ability to do the opposite of what one does. I am persuaded that this is not true. Consider the well-known illustration of someone who, unbeknownst to him, had his brain wired up with remote-controlled electrodes by a mad scientist who is an Obama supporter. When the man enters the voting booth, if he votes for Obama, the mad scientist will do nothing. But if he goes to vote for Romney, the mad scientist activates the electrodes which trigger him to vote for Obama instead. Now clearly, the man has no power in the situation to vote for Romney. But if he goes in and votes for Obama, doesn't he do so freely? After all, the scientist did nothing in this case. It is just as if the man were not wired with the electrodes at all. This thought experiment suggests that what is crucial to freedom of the will is not the ability to do the opposite, but the absence of external causal constraints upon one's choice. It is entirely up to you. In God's case, he is clearly free from such external causal constraints and therefore does the good freely. So he is not a moral automaton at all, but a free agent. Link to this in the description. End quote, by the way. Now, this is one of my favorite things where Craig is demonstrably wrong, and there are two very large problems here. Now, the first is that his thought experiment is demonstrably false. Note that in the situation where the voter freely chooses to vote Obama, and so the mad scientist doesn't have to trigger the device that would force the person to vote for Obama, that doesn't change the fact that the person could have chosen otherwise, even if they could not have acted otherwise. Note that in this scenario, the only thing the mad scientist could have done was identify that the voter had chosen to vote for Romney, and then would trigger his electrodes to force them to pull the arm for Obama. However, in this scenario, the choice to vote for Romney was still there, even if the person couldn't have acted on that choice. The principle of alternative possibilities, which is the philosophical term of what Craig is arguing against, is not actually falsified in this thought experiment as the principle of alternative possibilities applies to libertarian free will. In fact, in principle, libertarian free will entails that you couldn't falsify the principle of alternative possibilities because the choice is something of the mind, which is not supposed to be deterministic. If the scientist could somehow trigger the electrodes to make the person choose to vote for Obama, then it would indicate determinism. And if determinism was true, then libertarian free will would be false. As such, it seems that Craig fails to do away with the intuitive and widely defended notion of libertarian free will as the ability to have chosen otherwise. Now, Craig's second problem is that his apologetic fails even if we granted his definition of libertarian free will. He wrongly contends that libertarian free will isn't defined as it classically is as the freedom to do the opposite, but rather to be free from external causal constraints. The problem is that by God's very nature, as the supposed necessary being, God necessarily gets to decide and control what our natures are like. Perhaps Craig might say that on this scheme of libertarian free will, God makes it so that we may not be free in necessarily preferring a nutritious meal to a rotting carcass or in our favorite flavor of ice cream, but we are free in choosing to love God or not. But then he would also have to say that we are not really free in loving our children, because by our nature we have an immense attachment to them and a desire to love and protect them. Similarly, children by nature trust and form bonds with their parents so long as they are not mistreated. This is not to mention the mountains of apologetics about how humans are designed to have a longing for God or a God-shaped hole in our hearts, which contradicts the idea that God created our natures so that we could freely choose to love God or not. But the problem actually goes much deeper. In fact, Craig's entire endorsement of Molinism and the free will defense itself rests on the nature of an individual person being what determines what they will always freely choose in any given situation. So when we talk about Bob freely choosing X in situation Y, that gets us back to the rigid designator of any given person on Molinism, and Craig can't avoid this without tearing down the entire Molinistic framework as I laid out earlier. God gets to choose to create Bob 0 or Bob 1 or Bob whatever number. And as such, God is deciding the nature of the individual he is creating, which in turn determines what he will supposedly always freely choose in given situation Y. The key here is that we are not just talking about a random choice X in situation Y, but this is directly tied to the question, will Bob freely choose to love and follow God given the sum total circumstances in his life? In such a Molinist scheme that Craig endorses, this freedom is entirely determined by the nature of the being created and being put into the world. If it was not, then God couldn't have the foreknowledge of what each person would do in any given situation. The fact is that Molinism as a doctrine entails that the nature of the created beings is chosen by God, because that's how God is able to have the foreknowledge of their supposedly free choices in any given situation, contradicting Craig's definition of libertarian free will. Now, there is one more attempt at a theodicy I want to cover before we end this out, and that is put forward by Christian apologist Dr. Josh Rasmussen. And there's a paper that I'm linking in the description box where he attempts to deal with the problem of God not having moral free will, and that fact undermining the idea of it having any value. I'll just quote the abstract from his paper. Theists typically think that the freedom to choose between right and wrong is a great good, yet they also typically think that the very best being, God, and inhabitants of the very, very best place, heaven, lack this kind of freedom. The question arises, if freedom to choose evil is so good, then why is it absent from the best being in the best place? I discuss articulations of this question in the literature and point out drawbacks of answers that have been proposed. I then propose a new answer by showing how freedom to do evil could result in certain good situations, even if it does not contribute to the intrinsic greatness of a certain being or place. End quote. Again, I'll link the whole paper in the description box. It's a pretty good read, and believe it or not, I actually quite like Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, and I will be interviewing him in the coming months, actually. Hopefully he doesn't hear this and not want to come on anymore. Now, Dr. Rasmussen claims that in a situation where a wife wants her husband to surprise her with a vase of her favorite flowers, the situation where her husband does that of his own accord, rather than being causally determined to do so by his wife, just seems prima facie to be a quote-unquote better situation. Now, I think the primary problem with this is that for Dr. Rasmussen to say the situation is better, there must be some normative ground for assessing situations beyond simply appealing to our intuitions. After all, theists are quite fond of demanding some sort of grounding for normativity from atheists, so it seems fair to ask what grounds this evaluation of a better situation. We know that the grounding can't be in God's nature because God simply does not get to choose whether or not he will love us. In fact, we could ask Dr. Rasmussen if it would be a quote-unquote better situation if God were not perfectly loving, but could in fact he could in fact choose whether or not to love us, being free to hate some of his creation. And so perhaps Dr. Rasmussen's Christian universalist outlook would be fatally flawed, and he should instead adopt some kind of Calvinist framework. Now, conversely, we might say that if there is no normative ground for assessing what is and is not a better situation, then why is it not the case for other normative properties, or all of morality for that matter? How do we even say that God is good? What grounds that? Unfortunately, I think Dr. Rasmussen's Theodicy just reduces down to, it seems as if free will with respect to morality seems value to us, even if God doesn't have it, and I don't see how the theist can hold to that and say that God is the greatest possible being if he lacks something that we find so valuable. And because of all of these reasons, I think it remains logically possible for God to have created a heaven world where n number of people all freely choose to do the good, and they also always freely choose to love God for whatever set of situations that God chooses to create for the world that we live in. If we say that a person can make free choices, even if their nature determines what they will freely do in any given situation, in a deterministic way so that God can know it, then heaven world is a logically possible world. If we deny that, then God can't be omniscient and can't foreknow what any given individual will do in the future in any specific situation, contradicting not only millennia of theology, but also a number of stories in the Christian Bible as well. Here, the theist must pick which way they want to go. Either the problem of evil is not defeated by the free will defense, or their deity cannot be omniscient and so cannot be God by definition. Have fun with that one. Thanks for listening.